Hello, and welcome to episode 15 of My Friend, the Rainbow Circle. Today I want to talk about Kurt Vonnegut. My voice is about to die. Today I want to talk about Kurt Vonnegut. I'm shooting from a different location because the animals are asleep, and that means they might not invade the show for once. I might have spoken too soon, because me talking this loudly might have woken them all up. But hopefully they'll all stay asleep. I love to have them invade my show. However, sometimes it's nice to have a break. Here comes Siku. Okay. Stay right there. But I wanted to talk about Kurt Vonnegut, and I'm surprised it took me 15 episodes to get around to it. Because he's one of my favorite authors, and he got me back into writing after I was rejected by governor school when I was in middle school, governor school in South Carolina. For those pretend audience members, maybe not from South Carolina, half jokingly, I assume my only audience is going to be my grandchildren, but I assume if anybody ever watches this, they might be from South Carolina. But governor school is a school of the arts in South Carolina. And I applied for the creative writing program in middle school. And they rejected me, and I was very sad, and I'd stopped writing. That's the last time I ever let rejection cause me to stop writing. For a couple of years, I stopped writing. So I say I've been writing steadily since I was 5, but that's not true, because I stopped in middle school for a couple of years. Then I read Cat's Cradle and Breakfast of Champions, and I started writing again. But I think everybody needs what I would call the mentor period, when you're just imitating somebody, and it's essentially your spiritual mentor. It's somebody who you learn how to write by writing like, and then you break out on your own. And so that was Kurt Vonnegut. Really starting with those 2 books. Sirens of Titan is really my favorite, but it really started with those 2 books. Thanks to my brother Paul. My brother's name is Paul. My name's Simon. That's a cosmic coincidence. You might find. Of course. That's a cosmic coincidence you might find in a Kurt Vonnegut book. But one of the reasons I thought about it, writing about him right now, is because I had a dream last night, or sort of this morning. I was sleeping. I fell asleep right here, and I had this dream on this couch. I fell asleep, and I had this dream, and it's kind of a sorry, the cats are chasing a moth right now. So they might knock things over any second now. I thought they would all stay quiet, but maybe I was wrong. But so I had this dream that I went to a wrestling show yesterday, and there's a group called the International Superstars, and long explanation about who the International Superstars are, and it was kind of random that it was them in the dream. This group of there were 3 of them there last night. I think there's 4 total. The International Superstars told me I needed to write another story about some characters I have called Old God and the Broken Heart. Actually, the one who told me was, and it might not be so random, because the one who told me was named Ellie, and her nickname is Dream Girl Ellie. So I might have been punning inside of my dream. But she told me I needed to write a story about my characters, Old God and the Broken Heart. And Old God and the Broken Heart were kind of like Kilgore Trout in the structure of the story. I mean, in their history and development of how they became central characters. They were just supporting characters at one point. I wrote this whole series of stories about Teddy Roosevelt being a superhero. and Old God and the Broken Heart were just these thugs. But then those names just sort of got stuck in my gut, and I couldn't let them go. And then they just sort of developed into their own characters, just outside of my control. And that's whenever that happens, you just have to listen to the processes. When a character just gets stuck there, and you didn't plan for them to be there, and they just won't let you go, you kind of have to go with it. And that's sort of what happens in Breakfast of Champions. And one of my favorite scenes in Breakfast of Champions, in Kilgore Trout, really started as essentially a joke character on Theodore Sturgeon. The name is a riff on Theodore Sturgeon. But Kilgore Trout was always kind of a joke character in a way. He wrote these ridiculous sci-fi books, and Kurt Vonnegut would just summarize them. So that was an indirect way of essentially writing a bunch of sci-fi novels that he didn't actually have to write, where the premise was more interesting than the actual writing the book would be, according to Kurt Vonnegut. So essentially a joke character, a satire character of Theodore Sturgeon, basically. And he took on a life of his own, and more than just a pun in Breakfast of Champions. There's a whole scene. My favorite scene is when Kurt Vonnegut enters the story as a character and talks to Kilgore Trout and says he wants to let him go. And Kilgore Trout ends up being this very complicated guy who transcends just being a joke. And Kurt Vonnegut says, you have a life of your own. I'm just going to let you go now. And that's one of my favorite scenes from a book that inspired me to keep writing. In middle school, my inspiration was Ghostbusters, the animated series. If my voice will hold up. Ghostbusters, the animated series. That's who I was writing like. I still love that show. It's still a great show. I should do a video about Ghostbusters, the animated series. It is very well written, actually. But the book that got me back into writing, my favorite scene is about a writer letting a character go. But that's kind of how I learned from that, essentially, that not to try to control characters too much. And I've talked about that before. And it has to do with the rainbow circle. I forgot to grab the actual rainbow circle for visual. But with the rainbow circle, the center is and there's my bird. All the other animals are very quiet and sleepy. Now the bird's going to start singing. This is the soundtrack, I guess. But the center is the pure visceral impulse. So the center is just the life of the story. And that's a good way to think of it, is pure, uncontrolled, living force of the story. The outer rim is the control, the destimulation, the elimination of life, essentially, turning something into a robot at its most extreme form. That shows up in sci-fi all the time. And so, for a character to have life, you can't control it too much. You can't control him or her too much. And the further you get to the outer rim, the more hierarchical it becomes. So if you are enforcing control from a hierarchical perspective of an author controlling a character, you're going to quash the life. And that's not an either or. It's a spectrum. So, I mean, there's definitely a certain amount of control that you have to have. But if you exert too much force onto a character. It will quash the character's life. So, and that's something that I really got from Kurt Vonnegut. And I love and appreciate about him. And I will always love and appreciate all of his books. I've read most of his books. I have a handful that I haven't quite gotten around to yet. But he has terrible writing advice, just terrible. It was so disappointing. It makes me very sad that his writing advice is just I don't know, I was about to say the worst. I don't know if it's the worst. There's much worse than his, but it's just garbage, unfortunately. It makes me so sad. Of all the people, I've been searching for great writing advice for decades now. Have not found much. Not a lot in the realm of, I mean, basically nothing in the realm of fiction. I've found some in the realm of theater. Like Artaud's advice, I think, is good advice. And Ionesco's advice is good advice. But in the realm of fiction, I just haven't found any. And that's in writing classes, in books, articles by writers, just all over the place. Nobody can ironically, can articulate just really good advice. I like Jack Kerouac's advice. But it is a little crazy. I mean, his is probably the closest to decent advice, and I quote his advice all the time. But a lot of it is kind of nonsense. You're a genius all the time. I tell people that. I'll talk about Kerouac's advice one of these days. It's the closest to what in fiction is the closest to how I feel, I guess. But I want to talk about his advice and just why it's really bad. But also, I don't want to insult him too much because I do love him. I just wanted to foreground that with how much I do love him and how much he still inspires me. But thinking about it, so I don't know what my Old God and the Broken Heart story is going to be. I've written about 5 or 6 or 7 different Old God and the Broken Heart stories over the years. And so I don't know quite what it will be. I have the shreds of what it would be just by the nature of the characters. That's just how they work. They developed. I mean, I'm sort of brainstorming out loud in a way, but they were thugs, and so they sort of function in the schema. That's level 3, just understanding the formal expectations of the text, understanding. If it's a superhero story, what is the basic structure of that? And either sticking to it consistently or defying the expectations strategically. I'll be able to talk about that soon. I was thinking about doing something about birds, and then that dream came up. Birds, the movie, the Hitchcock movie, which is a fascinating thing to look at in terms of schema. And then that dream came up, and I said, eventually I should talk about Kurt Vonnegut. And I think the reluctance is just how much I hate his advice. And it makes me sad. But the schema of an Old God and the Broken Heart story is that they're thugs and people hire them, villains, supervillains. Of course, I'm a superhero fan. Unapologetically and unsurprisingly. I'm a big superhero nerd. But so they're the villain thugs, and villains hire them to do, their dirty work. But they're just kind of losers and schlubs, and the only thing they have is each other, and they're both physically deformed. So the only people who love them is one another. So Old God is always grouchy and cynical and hates the world, and the Broken Heart is always very sensitive, and so. But they protect each other, and in that way, that's the paradox of each of them. Old God is very, very cynical and doesn't believe in anything, but he believes in his best friend. The Broken Heart is very sensitive, but he's willing to do anything for his best friend, so he's willing to face dangers. He's just a heart. He's just a floating heart. And he's willing to face mortal danger for his friend. So But I love those two characters. I love writing about them. So let's say, hypothetically, I'm a writing student and I don't know anything about writing. And I say, let me look up all these top 10 lists of 10 rules and 12 rules and 20 rules. And rules is such a terrible thing to call them when it comes to writing. I wish people would stop doing that. However, I think Kurt Vonnegut calls them 8 basics of writing. And they're basic. At least he doesn't call them rules. They're basic, yeah. I mean, they're basic garbage, but mostly garbage. But I love him. I have to keep saying that whenever I talk about this. So let's say I'm trying to, I have this idea. I have these two characters named Old God and the Broken Heart, and I want to write a story about them, but I don't know what the story's going to be. But the first one is don't waste the time of strangers. And that's basically like saying nothing. I mean, there's so many bits of writing advice that are functionally the equivalent of saying nothing at all. And the one that you hear on so many lists is great writers or good writers read. Sure. Good humans breathe. Okay. Great doctors use scalpels. It's not real advice. And that saddens me. I wish Kurt Vonnegut he's breaking his own rule. He's wasting my time with that rule by saying don't waste somebody's time, or that guideline, I guess. I hate making fun of Kurt Vonnegut because I love him so much. So let's say, okay, I have these two characters. I don't know what they're going to do. What should they do? Well, they shouldn't waste your reader's time. Okay. And that's it. I have nothing to work with there. Give the audience one character to root for. Well, no crap. But, and if you think about like Kilgore Trout, I love Kilgore Trout. And pretty much every character in Breakfast of Champions is pretty reprehensible. I mean, Kilgore Trout's this grouchy guy. I mean, Old God is a lot like Kilgore Trout. He's very cynical and grouchy. But he's this very grouchy guy and very cynical guy. There's nothing really likable about him. So, what more specific can you give than just saying root for somebody? Should I have is there any danger of me writing a story where I'm not going to root? There's going to be a character I don't root for. It's just non-advice. It's just words on a page that don't do anything. Probably my least favorite, and really bothers me because it's in the territory of decent advice. Every character should want something, even if it's a glass of water. Which is terrible advice, but it's essentially the half of a good bit of advice. What if a character just wanted a glass of water? So if I'm trying to write this story about Old God and the Broken Heart, and I said the story is Old God wants a glass of water, and then he gets it, and then the story's over. That's not really a story. If the broken heart, who is a heart, wants a glass of water, he doesn't have a mouth, he doesn't have hands. Suddenly that becomes a story because he has obstacles, and sometimes people will frame it that way. And that's a bit better. I mean, wanting something as a start, that essentially makes it a story. I mean, if you break down how any sort of art form works, there's visceral stimulation from, irrational sources. To make it a story, it needs to be an empathetic experience. To make it a linear story, with the beginning and end, somebody needs to want something. And it doesn't have to be linear. I mean, Doesn't have to be that. Not every story needs to be somebody wanting something, but that's a good basic starting point. So I can look at Old God and the Broken Heart, and I could say, what do they want? And they're thugs for hire, so they want money. Well, okay. What if they try to get money, and then they have uh, some kind of obstacle for getting money? That's a story. It's kind of a flat story, though. They're just greedy. If I took rooting characters to root for and wanting something, and I added those together, how can I shape that story about them wanting money so that I actually root for them wanting money? I mean, there's little shreds of possible advice in there, but it's not in any shape that's useful right now. But if you think about, this is where level 2 comes in. So in the rainbow circle, number 1 is visceral, purely irrational visceral stimulation. Level 2 is the paradox. So what is pulling against the pure, what is the one step pulling against the pure visceral stimulation? So Old God and the Broken Heart want money because they're very poor and pathetic loser thugs. But why do they want money? Are they just greedy, horrible people? No, it's because all they have is each other, and they want to take care of each other. So now you have a paradox. They're kind. They want something that the audience also would want, so I root for them. Even though what they're doing is probably terrible, because they're taking these jobs for horrible people who want to do horrible things. But that's the only job they're able to do well. So they have this, they're losers, and they know they're losers, so they have this low self-esteem, and so they're trying to pretend like they're tough because they're thugs, but they always lose. So you have the forces pulling against each other that make them much more compelling characters. And I'm not bragging about them because they came to life on their own. I did not force them to be in this shape. I love them because they spring fully formed like Athena from Zeus's head. There's a pretentious way of saying it. Like unto Athena from Zeus's head. So, there's so many ways that just wanting a glass of water is just a really bad way of shaping a story. I like how he talks about the shape of the story. I like that phrasing, but when he does talk about the shape of a story, it's still entirely useless advice, sadly. Sentences can only do two things. I feel like I should say more about the wanting a glass of water, because that sticks in my craw. There's so many ways to make wanting a glass of water a better story. Someone's allergic to the water. I did this in an exercise a couple months ago. This specific, really bad advice. Somebody's allergic to water, but is going to dehydrate. Somebody's in the desert, and their loved one is dying. That's a good writing exercise to take Kurt Vonnegut's sadly bad advice and actually make it good advice. How do you actually turn that into, a decent story? Anyway, I gotta move on. Sentences must do two things: reveal characters or advance the plot, which is nonsense. Sentences can do. That's part of the problem with rules, calling any of these rules. Because why are we saying that sentences are incapable of doing an infinite number of things? Even if we just said a third thing would be a sentence can be beautiful. Let it be beautiful. Why are we limiting what a sentence can do? Drives me crazy. Hemingway is the worst at this crap because everybody just quotes him. I never heard any writing teacher quoting Vonnegut. He deserves to be an inspiration to millions through his stories, but it's not through his advice. But I constantly hear writing teachers quoting Hemingway, and that's far, far worse. But why are we limiting? Why ever limit sentences to two things that they can do? They can be random collections of sounds, and that would be marvelous. Make sentences do everything. I hate that type of advice. I didn't mean for this to turn into a hate. I hate that because I love Vonnegut so much. Start close to the end. I have no idea why. Start wherever you want to start. I don't know why that's a thing. Be a sadist is the next one. It's not bad. Um, I would say of all of the advice, that might be one of the most useful. Be a sadist, and then number 7, write for just one person. Those are the ones I would save from this whole list. And be a sadist, I think works as advice because just imagining if I'm a young writer who's never, you know, read advice before or something like that. If I haven't written a whole lot, and I said, hey, I have these 2 characters I want to write about. I'm not sure what I want to do with them. What should I do? And I read Be a Sadist. That gives me something to work with. It's not the most articulate advice, but it does give me something to work with at least. Whereas the other ones don't really. If I didn't know a character should want something, that might be helpful. But I hope if I have a character, that's a starting point. You never know. I mean, young writers, a lot of them probably will leave that off, sadly. So the character should want something. I mean, if you added a lot of these together, you might have a decent story. A character to root for, a character wanting something, and then horrible things happening to that character. You have a basic story there, sure. But yeah, I mean, I think if, I've had these 2 characters and I said, Old God and the Broken Heart, I'm not sure what they're going to do. I should be a sadist to them, so I should make horrible things happen to them. And that's the entertaining thing about, when I write about characters who spring to life spontaneously, I get as much entertainment out of watching what ends up happening to them. But that's part of the entertainment, is just having all these horrible things happen to them, and I feel bad for them. But it's tragicomic stories because they'll be hired by this horrible person to do horrible things, and then they'll fail terribly and be harmed by the experience. And it's sadistic and masochistic and voyeuristic and all these horrible things. And if you really explored that, that's kind of what I would say that's better advice, is to don't be afraid of sadism or don't be afraid of masochism. Those are not faults. Those are just natural to storytelling. That's just how storytelling works. Don't be ashamed that your tendency as a storyteller is to be sadistic. So anyway, there's a lot to pull from that works a lot better. But write to please one person. I'm totally for that one. And I talked about that with Frank O'Hara. Personism, a Manifesto, is essentially about that. So I support that one, at least. So I support two bits of advice. One of the worst bits of advice is to give all the info. And yeah, I would say it's bad, but it kind of works only for a certain small amount of writers. And this is sort of where a preview of what I'm going to say about the birds. I was thinking about all these things to say about the birds, and then I had this dream, and I said, I'm going to talk about Kurt Vonnegut instead. So these are crossing over. But imagine the birds if you started out the birds by saying, here's the exact reason why birds are attacking. It would be a much less interesting movie. So I don't know why. I think it's a very narrowly focused bit of advice for a very small amount of writers who just have no facility with suspense. Um, if somebody's struggling with suspense, an option would be just give up on suspense and tell everything. If you were trying to write the birds and you were failing completely, and then you tried a different tactic and you said, let me just say everything up front, and that worked better. That's just an option. That's not. I don't know why Kurt Vonnegut is saying do that for every story. It's a terrible idea. Um, as much as I love you, Kurt Vonnegut. So if I was writing my Old God and the Broken Heart story, part of the thing that I like to play with characters like that is they are physically deformed. One of them is only a heart. It's a giant heart inside this metal cage, and I have no interest in explaining how he's able to live. And I think there's a whole set of things to talk about there in terms of audience expectation about explanations of seemingly impossible things. I don't think there's any need to explain how he's able to live. Some people might say, how is a disembodied heart able to eat or do any of these other things? He just does. I don't really care what the actual explanation is. That's just who the character is. I don't really feel as though I did create the character. He created himself. Why don't you ask him? I have no idea. But I don't think that's really relevant. But I think Kurt Vonnegut is there. He's talking about creating suspense. So if I had, I don't know, I haven't even thought of a decent story. When I was trying to, this is something. A better bit of advice is cultivating your hypnagogic mind. And the hypnagogic mind is just what I call it. I don't know if that's even scientifically accurate, but the hypnagogic mind is the part of the mind that makes free associations in the subconscious and essentially links the dreaming mind to the waking mind, where you can train it to be able to pull up dream imagery just whenever you really want it to. If you force dream imagery out, it's not going to really be dream imagery, but you can really train yourself to have a freer sort of access to your hypnagogic mind. But I was trying to think of, the other day I was trying to think of, what to talk about, what else to talk about. I was kind of fixated on the birds topic. But I was trying to think of what else to talk about, and I just free associated this monster that looked kind of like a Hieronymus Bosch monster that had these little tiny robots living on top of him. I don't know. It was compelling. I mean, that's part of cultivating the hypnagogic mind is, just lots and lots of images. If you're able to really pull up these images, you just pick out whichever one is stimulating, whichever one you find interesting. And so this creature, who knows if it'll go anywhere. But this creature, this Hieronymus Bosch with robots living on top of him, I have no idea. He could be, the main character, one of the other characters in my Old God and the Broken Heart story, and he could, I don't know, he could drop a letter in the mailbox and say, "I know what you did. I know what you did last summer." And that, Old God and the Broken Heart would freak out about it, of course. And I'm going to kill you because of what you did, or whatever. Old God and the Broken Heart could freak out about it, and why would I say what the actual mystery is? That doesn't make any sense to me. Why Kurt Vonnegut would say that? That's one, it's sort of like number one is don't waste anybody's time, but that's a waste of time. That one is essentially saying don't ever write mysteries. Ever. Mysteries are just not things that you should ever try. Doesn't make any sense. And it in and of itself is a mystery. I don't know why anyone would give that advice. Doesn't make any sense. But then he says after that, Flannery O'Connor broke all these rules, so don't listen to me. And you get that with a lot of these bits of advice, and that is, that's silly. That's very silly. And when I read this list of advice, because I love Vonnegut so much, and you'll find this when you love someone and they do something that you don't like. I mean, this you'll find a lot of people interpret writers that they love this way. When a writer you love does something you don't like, what you tend to say is that must be a satire. Kurt Vonnegut did it. Why did I pronounce it that way? Kurt Vonnegut did a lot of satire. So I wouldn't put it past him to write a list of advice that was total nonsense. I don't really think it is, but because I love him, that forces me to think. There's a whole lot of meta advice in that too. Filling in the blanks. When somebody does something you don't like, filling in the blanks to make it something that you do like. There's tons of you can read it. You can learn about storytelling from that concept alone. Just thinking about that concept alone, you can actually learn more about writing from just thinking about that concept alone than this list of advice. But because I like him, I like to think about this as satire. Because I don't like Hemingway, I don't really give him that much credit. But if it's satire, he does, he satirizes arguably one of the most annoying habits. I knew some animal would get in my face eventually. There's Bo. Okay. Which I don't mind, but every other animal is asleep right now. But at the end, he satirizes one of the more annoying things that writers do at the end of these lists of rules. He says, Flannery O'Connor broke all these rules. So you shouldn't listen to me. And I'm not gonna listen to. I mean, you're right. That's the most right thing he says in the whole list is that here's this great writer who broke all of these rules. So don't follow them. And I'm not going to follow them because they're bad rules. At least he doesn't call them rules. But you'll see these lists where they'll say, the number one rule is there are no rules. So don't write them as rules. I don't understand why you have the necessity to even call them rules. Making rules is a bad idea with any sort of creative field. Except for very narrow circumstances, of course. One of my least favorite cliches, I hate all these cliches, but one of the most absurd cliches, I should say. It's so absurd, it's hard to hate it, really, just because it's a total cop-out, is you have to know the rules to break them. Then why do rules to begin with? That's ridiculous. Don't call them rules then. By definition, if you have to know the rules to break them, they are not rules then. But anyway. So Vonnegut kind of does that. But anyway. I hate to end on negative things. This is the most negative thing that I know about Vonnegut, because I love everything about him. But instead of, this is my educational experience, all of these different things disappointing me about this writer I love, And the fact that he taught at Iowa, which is might be, I mean, Flannery O'Connor, another great writer, another Iowa writer. Kurt Vonnegut, another Iowa writer. So I'll complain about the Iowa Writers Workshop all day long, and how much harm it's done to the universe. And then people will say, well, Kurt Vonnegut and Flannery O'Connor, and I'll say, well, yeah, I think despite Iowa, they were great. There's no excuse for Raymond Carver, though. I can't tolerate Raymond Carver at all. But, right for one person, Raymond Carver ain't writing for me. Kurt Vonnegut's writing for me. Flannery O'Connor, to a degree. But not Raymond Carver. So I'll end on something positive. You should read Breakfast of Champions. I think reading the book is a whole lot more educational than... you can learn a lot more about writing from reading Breakfast of Champions or Cat's Cradle than you can actually learn from this list of non-advice. It set me off on breaking linearity for years and years and years and years. And I mentioned the detective novel that I wrote. I ended up writing 3, but part of writing the detective novel was essentially... Okay. So you can sit down. There we go. Writing the detective novel was to because I had gotten so far away from linearity because of Kurt Vonnegut that I needed to figure out... I forgot how to do linear. So I said, what's the most linear possible type of novel that I would be interested in writing all the way through? A detective novel. And that's definitely one where you would never, it would be really bad advice to say, give all the secrets up front, because then it wouldn't be a detective novel. It would just be a very different type of book. But breaking linearity, I think he's one of the best at taking the time frame and breaking it down. And looking at something like, you can look at how, I think probably the way to frame his advice as good advice, something I did learn, is to look at how in things like, probably most famously in something like Slaughterhouse-Five. One of my favorite scenes in Slaughterhouse-Five is when he talks about Billy Pilgrim dying. If you create a strong enough character, like Billy Pilgrim is a great character, if you create a strong enough character, you could say, this is when and how Billy Pilgrim dies. He does that, spoiler alert, I guess, sort of. He kind of does that in the middle of the book. But in the middle of the book, it jumps around in time. Billy Pilgrim's come unstuck in time, is the famous line. But in the middle of the book, he says, here is where and how Billy Pilgrim dies. If you have a good, strong character that you care about, that you can root for, pulling the positive out of this list of advice that I don't like, if you have this character you can root for, the next step is you're able to create suspense, even knowing something like when and how the character is going to die. You're not specifically worried about when he dies, because you already know when he dies. But because Billy Pilgrim is such a strong character who wants something, that's the thing about Billy Pilgrim is, if you say a great character should always want something, even if it's a glass of water. If you think about Billy Pilgrim, what exactly does he want? He wants to be happy? I don't know. He wants to not fight in the war anymore. He's a bit of a passive character. I should talk about that one day, how passive characters can still be great characters. Billy Pilgrim is a bit of a passive character. But, you can get to something like Bombing of Dresden, and the Bombing of Dresden is still a very tense, suspenseful episode in the book, and you know very well he doesn't die in the bombing of Dresden. So if you want to learn how do you take a character and create a suspenseful scene, even knowing that the character is going to survive. How do you create a character you can root for, whether he wants something tangible or not? Definitely actually read the stories. Don't read the advice. Read the stories because they're excellent. If that's the kind of story you want to write. If you want to write like Hemingway, read his stories and take his advice. I guess. If you want to write like Kurt Vonnegut, don't take his advice, but definitely read his stories. Definitely read all of his novels. But I will wrap it up for today. Say goodnight, animals. Oh, you already said goodnight. Okay, good night.